This presentation is about what the bees do as part of a swarming. I know we've probably all taken courses or learned about how to manage swarming behavior as beekeepers, but this is what the bees are thinking about as they prepare to swarm and find a new home. I like to start by sharing a quote that I came across from a British entomologist who lived from 1899 to 1994. Um, Brian Wigglesworth. And the quote is, "The honeybee is as far above the general run of other insects as humans are above mammals. Their complexity of the social life of bees, their powers of mutual communication, their diversity in skills and employment, their debates and decisions on policy are so remarkable that they raise the question of the capacity of the honeybee for thinking." And I think if you're not familiar with the research that I'm going to go over, I think you'll appreciate that quote once we've gone through this. Um, so how do they find a new home? Well, the most important job in this process is the scout bee. And once a colony has decided to swarm, the most experienced and oldest foragers stop foraging. They stop looking for food, they stop collecting food, and they change job descriptions and they start looking for a new home. And if you think about it, there's intelligence there because they know the landscape, they know the environment. And at some level, they've probably been thinking about cavities or holes or dark spaces that they can start to explore. And so when the colony has decided that it needs to split and find a new home, the oldest and most experienced foragers become scout bees. And they fly around and they look for new places to live. What's also interesting is, as you know, when a colony prepares to swarm, they start to raise new queens as a supersedure process. These scout bees, in addition to looking for a new place for the colony to take up home, they're also the ones checking on the maturity of those queen cells, because the old queen and the swarm need to leave before those queen cells hatch. So they're monitoring that as well as looking around in the landscape and the environment around them to find a new home. And it's estimated that in a swarm of say 15 to 20,000 bees, there's probably 300 to 500 scout bees that have been looking for a new place to live. It is a lot, yeah. So what are they looking for? What's the ideal hive criteria when they're out looking for places to live? Now, the ideal capacity is a cavity of about 40 liters in space. So if you think about a large canister of a petrol or 40 liters of paint, that size of a capacity. And typically no smaller than 10 liters and no bigger than 100 liters in capacity. The height above the ground, ideally, is at least 5 meters. The position of the entrance in relation to the cavity, they're looking for something towards the bottom. The entrance size is about 12 centimeters squared. And now the research that's underlying this was done in North America, here in the Southern Hemisphere. The orientation the ideal orientation would be north, because that's where you're going to get most sun and warmth throughout the year. So why have the honeybees selected these criteria as the most beneficial? Well, if you think about it, a larger space means more honey, and they can store more honey and survive the winter. It's also easier to regulate the temperature. The height above the ground is less of an issue here, although it can be an issue here. It's really about colony defense. In North America, you have animals like bears and raccoons that can get into hives. Here, it's less of an issue, but the research shows that they look for something a bit higher up. Bottom of the cavity for thermal regulation, because heat rises, and it's easier for them to manage the heat within the space. And entrance size, smaller is better because they can defend it more easily. And the entrance being north is, again, thermal regulation or heat regulation. There's a preference if there's comb already in the cavity, obviously, because they don't have to spend time and energy building new comb, and possibly there might be honey in that comb. Why is this decision so important, the size of the cavity that they choose? In an ideal size cavity, 73% of swarms, colonies, will survive the winter in a cavity that's about 40 liters capacity. But if that swarm chooses the wrong cavity and they go into a cavity that's too small, only about 27% of those swarms will survive the winter. So it's literally a life and death decision that these bees are making as they scout for a new place to live. So the scouting process. So again, the oldest and most experienced foragers are out looking for a new space to live. When they find a cavity, they initially, on their first visit, she will spend about as much as an hour walking around the inside of that cavity. Um, the bees will also do short, like half-second flights, jumps within the cavity, and they just walk around and around and around, and they're getting information every time they look and perceive what's inside the space. They will come back and they'll visit the site multiple times. On average, in their subsequent visits, they'll spend about 13 minutes each visit. And they can spend a visit as much as 10 times. Every time that they visit the hive, they're leaving an attractant pheromone so that their other scout bees will be able to come back and find this spot. And a scout bee, if you add up all the times that she visits that site, will walk the equivalent of 60 meters inside that space. And I did some calculations on the average footprint of an Australian home. And that's the equivalent, if you're house hunting, of walking into a new home and walking around 8 kilometers inside that house to get a sense of whether that's an ideal space for you to live. So they're thorough. Yeah, so what's really interesting is most of this research was done on an island about 10 kilometers off the coast of Maine. And it was an island that has no trees, but it has abundant blackberry and poison ivy, both great sources of pollen and nectar for bees. So Thomas Seeley, who did this research, was able to set up um, um, hive bait boxes of all different sizes and dimensions. And so he did over many years just put up 10-liter boxes, 40-liter boxes, 15-liter boxes, and did these tests. And because the bees had nowhere else to go, they had to swarm and find a home in one of his boxes. And so he would put cameras in them. He and his researchers would literally sit outside, and as a scout bee arrived, they'd pick up the scout bee, mark her with a specific number, and so they tabulated exactly all the activities of each of the scout bees. It's really kind of remarkable. So what do they do with all this information, these scout bees that are um, looking around the environment to find a new place to live? Well, they come back and do the waggle dance. So we know the waggle dance as how foragers communicate to their colonies of where the great sources of pollen and nectar are. Well, the same information is conveyed with a waggle dance on the ideal place to live. And so if you've caught a swarm, and I've done this when I've gone up to a swarm, and before I came across this research, I thought, because I saw bees doing waggle dance on the swarm cluster, I thought, oh, they found some food and they're going to find some food and feed the swarm. But those were actually scout bees communicating to the swarm the location of new places to live. And if you don't know, we won't go into it in depth, but basically the rigor or the level of excitement or the agitation that the bee does in the dance as she does these circles communicates how great the new location is. The distance that she travels in the loops that she does communicates the distance away from the swarm. And then she also does the dance on an angle on the top of the surface, and that communicates the direction away, pointing to the sun, from the swarm that the other scout bees have to fly to find this location to assess it themselves. So we'll talk now a little bit about how they make this decision. So again, you've got a swarm cluster. They're on a branch, they're on a wall, they're on a fence. And these scout bees are flying back and forth to different locations and communicating back to the cluster about where is the next place that we're going to live. So Thomas Seeley came up with this notation system. And so I'll just walk you through it here. So the swarm cluster is in the middle with the S. Each letter around the cluster is a potential new home. The arrows are pointing to the new home, the potential new home. And the thickness of the line signals the number of bees that are traveling back and forth there to assess this new place. So I'm going to take you through one case study that he presents in his research of a swarm that he watched. You can see that on July 20th, the swarm leaves the home hive at 11 a.m. And you can see that they're looking at 6 different places, A to F. And there are 18 bees doing 68 dances. So they're flying to different locations, checking them out, coming back and doing a dance. And if the scout bee thinks that the new home is really great, they're going to do a very vigorous dance. The loops that they do are going to be very long, and they're going to do many, many dances. They might do 30, 40, 50 dances in a row, and that's communicating to the bees, look, I think I found a really great place. If scout bee number two comes back from a mediocre place, maybe it's small, maybe it's too low to the ground, she's maybe going to do 15, 20 dances. She won't shake very vigorously. The loops won't be very large. And that communicates to the swarm, that's a mediocre site. So between 1 and 3 p.m., you can see that they gave up on F. There was no interest in F, but a new site came up, G, and some bees started to explore that. And B, there was quite a bit of interest in B. And again, this is all being communicated by the waggle dances that the bees are doing. Later in the afternoon, you can see that G and B are becoming much more interesting. And late that day, 3 new sites were found, and some bees started to explore those. And you can see at the bottom of the screen the number of bees and the number of dances. The following day, you can see they gave up on I, J, and E. They continued to explore 4 other sites, but really G and B were really getting a lot of attention. So there must have been something about those 2 sites that were attracting a lot of interest. And then you can see they give up quite quickly on several sites, and G and B are still remaining popular. On the 21st, it started to rain midday, so the scouting stopped midday. And by the next day, 73 bees did 352 dances for site G. And so the swarm took off at noon and found their new home. And all that decision making happened because of these waggle dances that were being done by the scout bees. So how do they get there? Because again, you've got 15, 20,000 bees on this random branch, on this random fence, on a random wall. Only 200 or 300 of those scout bees know where the new place is. How do they get that swarm of 15 to 20,000 bees to the new home? So a typical swarm has these measurements, and it was thought for a long time that the scout bees would emit through their Nasanov glands a scent, and the bees would follow that scent to the new home. Well, Thomas Seeley, it sounds a bit cruel, but Thomas Seeley, when he was doing this research to validate that hypothesis, actually took all the scout bees and glued their Nasanov glands shut. So they couldn't emit any pheromones, and they were still successful at finding the new location. So he had to test another hypothesis. So what he found was, as the swarm travels to the new location, most of the bees are doing these sort of circular flights within the cluster, and they're just sort of moving along relatively slowly. But the scout bees are doing streaking, what he calls streaking flights across the top of the swarm. And because the bees are looking up, they can see the scout bees and they know that this is a big deal, so we're moving to the new home. So they just follow the direction of those scout bees that are pointing them to the new home. And that's how they find their new home. Oh, thanks so much. Thanks.